This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it is not medical advice. I am not a doctor, and I am not diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Peptides and research compounds may carry serious risks, side effects, and unknown long-term outcomes. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider before starting, stopping, or combining any peptide, medication, or supplement. All right, welcome back to the Peptide Effect. Today we are breaking down a question that I get constantly, especially from people who are trying to lose weight, tighten up, and finally get that lean, athletic look. And the question is this: Cagrilintide versus AOD 9604. Which one is better for fat loss? Which one works faster? Which one is safer? And which one is more worth your money? Because if you have looked at peptide pricing lately, you already know this is not the era of cheap experimentation. People want results. And they want results without wasting time. So today I am going to compare these two peptides head-to-head in a real-world, practical way. Not just the science, but how they actually feel in the body, what kind of fat loss you can expect, who they are best for, and what mistakes people make when they choose one over the other. Now, let's start by making something very clear. Cagrilintide and AOD 9604 are not even in the same category of peptide. They both get talked about as fat loss peptides, and they both can be used in body recomposition protocols, but they work through completely different pathways. So comparing them is kind of like comparing a chainsaw to a scalpel. They both cut, but they do it in a completely different way. So, let's start with the basics. What is cagrilintide? Cagrilintide is a long-acting amylin analog, and amylin is a hormone that your body naturally produces along with insulin. When you eat food, your pancreas releases insulin, but it also releases amylin. And amylin's job is basically to help control appetite and slow gastric emptying, meaning it slows how fast food leaves your stomach, so you feel full longer. And it also signals the brain that you are satisfied. So if you have ever wondered why some people can eat half a sandwich and feel done and other people can eat an entire pizza and still want dessert, amylin signaling is one of those reasons. Now, cagrilintide is basically a designer version of that concept. It is engineered to last longer and have a stronger appetite effect. And the reason cagrilintide has exploded in popularity is because it stacks extremely well with GLP-1 medications and peptides. Things like semaglutide, tirzepatide, retatrutide, and even research GLP-1 blends. Because when you combine amylin activity with GLP-1 activity, you get a powerful appetite shutdown effect. Like the kind where people suddenly forget to eat. Not because they are forcing themselves, but because their brain is no longer screaming for dopamine through food. So that is cagrilintide. It is primarily an appetite and satiety peptide. Now, what is AOD 9604? AOD 9604 is a fragment of human growth hormone. It is not the full HGH molecule. It is a specific piece, a specific amino acid sequence, that was isolated because it appeared to trigger fat metabolism without triggering the full growth hormone effects. So, AOD 9604 is often described as a fat-burning growth hormone fragment. But what people need to understand is this. AOD is not designed to suppress appetite. AOD is designed to increase lipolysis, meaning fat breakdown, and reduce lipogenesis, meaning fat storage. So AOD is more about metabolic fat mobilization. Cagrilintide is more about appetite control. And that is the first big difference. One affects what goes in. The other affects what comes off. Now, let's get into the real comparison. If you are asking which one works better for weight loss, the honest answer depends on what kind of weight loss you mean. Because weight loss is not just one thing. There is scale weight. There is fat loss. There is water weight. There is appetite control. There is inflammation reduction. And there is body recomposition, which is fat loss plus muscle retention. So, let's start with what most people care about: the scale. Cagrilintide tends to produce faster scale movement in most people. And the reason is simple. If you are eating significantly less, you will lose weight. Period. That is the ugly truth. It does not matter what fancy compound you are using. If your caloric intake drops dramatically, the scale is going to move. Now, is all of that fat? Not always. Sometimes it is reduced water retention. Sometimes it is less food volume in the digestive system. Sometimes it is reduced inflammation. But still, the scale goes down. And psychologically, that is powerful. Because when people see that scale drop, they stay motivated. They stay consistent. And consistency is the actual magic. Now, AOD 9604, on the other hand, can feel slower. And that is because it is not forcing you to eat less. So if you are still eating like a raccoon in a dumpster at midnight, AOD is not going to save you. It is not going to override bad habits. But if your nutrition is already controlled, AOD can enhance fat burning. It can help stubborn fat areas. It can help tighten the look. And it can help create a leaner physique over time. So the first major takeaway is this. If you have a serious appetite problem, Cagrilintide is probably going to outperform AOD. If your appetite is already under control, AOD might be the better enhancer. Now, let's talk about the mechanism a little deeper. Because this is where it gets interesting. Cagrilintide works on the brain. It affects the appetite centers. It affects satiety signaling. It affects cravings. And it affects gastric emptying. So you are full faster and longer. That means you naturally eat less without forcing it. But it also means you can experience side effects like nausea. Or that heavy, food just sits in my stomach feeling. Some people describe it like they ate a Thanksgiving meal even if they only ate a yogurt. Now, AOD 9604 works more on fat tissue signaling. It is thought to stimulate the fat cells to release stored fatty acids. And it may increase the body's preference for using fat as fuel. That means it is more of a metabolic peptide. Now, the big question everyone asks is, does AOD increase growth hormone? And the answer is not in the same way that actual HGH does. AOD is not known for raising IGF-1 significantly. It is not known for causing the same kind of growth hormone side effects like organ growth, carpal tunnel, insulin resistance, and extreme water retention. That is why people like it. It is supposed to isolate the fat-burning portion without the rest. Now, does it always work that way? In theory, yes. In real life, the results can vary a lot. Some people swear AOD is the best fat loss peptide they have ever used. Others say it did absolutely nothing. And I think that comes down to two things. Number one, dosing and consistency. And number two, whether the person's lifestyle was already aligned with fat loss. Because AOD is not an appetite suppressant. It is a fat mobilizer. And if you are not in a calorie deficit, mobilized fat can just get stored again. Now, let's talk about dosing and what a typical experience feels like. Cagrilintide is typically dosed once weekly. And that is one reason it is so popular. People love weekly peptides. They love not having to inject daily. They love the convenience. AOD 9604 is usually dosed daily, sometimes even twice daily. And this is where people start to get annoyed. Because daily injections require discipline. And when you miss doses, you lose momentum. So convenience goes to Cagrilintide. But AOD has its own advantage. It is usually very tolerable. Most people do not feel sick on AOD. Most people do not feel nauseous. Most people do not feel that heavy stomach effect. AOD is often described as subtle. Almost too subtle. Like you wonder if it is working. But then after a few weeks you notice your body composition looks better. So, the experience difference is huge. Cagrilintide feels powerful. AOD feels quiet. Now, let's talk about what kind of fat loss each one is known for. Cagrilintide tends to produce overall weight loss. And it often reduces food obsession. It is the kind of peptide that can stop binge eating behavior. It can stop late-night snacking. It can stop the constant hunger. And for many people, that is life-changing. Because if you have struggled with food noise, the voice in your head that always wants something sweet or salty, that voice can get dramatically quieter. Now, AOD is known for something else. AOD is often used for stubborn fat. Things like belly fat, lower abdomen, love handles. Some women use it for thigh fat. Some people use it for that soft look that just will not tighten up. And the reason people like it is because it is not crushing appetite. So you can still eat normal meals. You can still enjoy food. But you are supposedly burning more fat. Now, Does it work like a magic fat eraser?
No.
Nothing does. But it can be a supportive tool. Now, let's talk about side effects. Cagrilintide side effects are mostly gastrointestinal.
Nausea.
Fullness. Constipation. Sometimes acid reflux. Sometimes fatigue, especially early on. And sometimes people feel almost emotionally flat because food no longer gives them dopamine hits. Now that might sound weird, but it is real. Some people miss the joy of eating because their appetite is so suppressed. Now, AOD 9604 side effects are usually mild. Some people report headaches. Some report injection site irritation. Some report slight fatigue. But overall, it is considered a pretty tolerable peptide. Now, if you're stacking these with other compounds, side effects can change. Because if you stack cagrilintide with a GLP-1 like semaglutide, you can amplify the appetite suppression to an extreme level. And that can lead to dehydration, low blood sugar symptoms, electrolyte imbalance, constipation, and in some cases, people undereat protein, which is a huge problem. Because losing weight is not the goal. Losing fat while keeping muscle is the goal. Now, let's talk about muscle retention. This is a big one. When people lose weight too quickly from appetite suppression, they often lose muscle too. Because if you are not eating enough protein and you are not lifting weights, your body will break down muscle. And this is why some people end up skinny fat after GLP-1 style weight loss. They lose pounds, but they look softer. They lose curves. They lose glutes. They lose strength. And their metabolism slows. So cagrilintide can be amazing, but it must be paired with protein and resistance training. Now, AOD 9604, because it is tied to the growth hormone fragment pathway, is often believed to be more muscle-sparing. Not necessarily muscle building, but muscle-sparing. Meaning you can lose fat while keeping a better physique. But again, it depends on lifestyle. Now, let's talk about who should use cagrilintide. Cagrilintide is best for people who have appetite issues, people who overeat, people who snack, people who binge, people who cannot stop thinking about food, people who feel hungry all the time even when they eat enough, and also people who are using a GLP-1 but have plateaued. Because stacking amylin with GLP-1 can push fat loss further. Cagrilintide is also great for people who need aggressive weight loss for health reasons. High blood pressure, prediabetes, high cholesterol, sleep apnea, fatty liver,
Things like that.
Now who should use AOD 9604? AOD is best for people who already have their diet mostly in check. People who work out. People who want body recomposition. People who want stubborn fat reduction. People who want to tighten their look without destroying appetite. And also people who do not tolerate GLP-1 type nausea. If you are the kind of person who gets sick easily from peptides, AOD may be a better option. Now, let's talk about the biggest myth. And the biggest myth is that AOD 9604 is a miracle fat burner. AOD is not a miracle. It is a supportive peptide. It can enhance fat loss. But it is not going to override overeating. And it is not going to replace training. Now, the biggest myth about cagrilintide is that it burns fat directly. Cagrilintide does not burn fat directly. It changes behavior. It changes appetite. It changes satiety. And the result is fat loss. But the fat loss comes from reduced caloric intake. So, in a way, cagrilintide is a brain peptide. AOD is a metabolism peptide. Now, let's talk about speed. If someone asked me which one will make you lose weight faster, I would say cagrilintide. If someone asked me which one might improve body composition over time with fewer side effects, I would say AOD. But again, it depends on the person. Now, let's talk about the type of person who will be disappointed by cagrilintide. The person who expects it to sculpt their body without working out. Because yes, you will lose weight, but you might lose it in the wrong places. You might lose glutes. You might lose breasts. You might lose muscle tone. And you might end up looking smaller but not tighter. So, if you use cagrilintide, you must lift weights.
And you must eat protein.
Now, the type of person who will be disappointed by AOD is the person who wants dramatic appetite suppression. If you want to stop eating, AOD is not going to do that. AOD is not going to stop cravings. So if you are an emotional eater, AOD will feel like it does nothing. Now, let's talk about stacking potential, because this is where things get really interesting. Cagrilintide stacks beautifully with GLP-1 peptides. It can also stack with things like L-carnitine, mic injections, and even NAD protocols. And some people stack it with growth hormone secretagogues like CJC and ipamorelin because they want fat loss plus muscle preservation. Now, AOD stacks well with growth hormone secretagogues too. In fact, AOD is often paired with CJC and ipamorelin because the idea is to support fat loss while enhancing recovery and body composition. AOD also stacks well with things like tesamorelin. But you have to be careful, because stacking too many peptides can create fatigue and inflammation, and you might not know which compound is doing what. Now, let's talk about cost effectiveness. This is a huge topic, because if you are paying premium prices, you want to know what gives the biggest bang for your buck. Cagrilintide is usually more expensive per vial, but it is dosed weekly, so your monthly cost might actually be reasonable. AOD can sometimes be cheaper per vial, but you are using it daily, so you may burn through it quickly. So depending on sourcing and dosing, AOD can sometimes end up being just as expensive or more expensive over time. Now, let's talk about the psychology. This is something people do not talk about enough. Cagrilintide changes your relationship with food. Some people feel freedom. They feel relief. They feel like they can finally breathe. They can go to restaurants and not obsess. They can be around snacks and not feel possessed. And for some people, that is the first time in their life they have ever experienced that. But there is a downside. Some people feel like their personality changes. They do not enjoy food. They do not get pleasure from eating. And if you're someone who uses food as comfort, you may feel emotionally uncomfortable at first, because suddenly your coping mechanism is gone. Now, AOD does not do that. AOD lets you still enjoy food, but it may not give you the same dramatic sense of control. So it depends on what you need psychologically. Now, let's talk about the biggest mistake people make. The biggest mistake is thinking that fat loss is only about fat burning. Fat loss is about habits. And peptides are tools. They are not the foundation. So if you use Cagrilintide but you do not prioritize protein, you will lose muscle. If you use AOD but you do not create a calorie deficit, you will not lose fat. So both peptides require strategy. Now, let's talk about which one is better for women versus men. In women, Cagrilintide can be incredibly effective because women often struggle with appetite fluctuations tied to hormones, PMS cravings, stress eating, cortisol-driven hunger, and Cagrilintide can smooth that out. But women also tend to be more sensitive to nausea. So, dosing matters. Now, AOD is often popular in women because it is not as harsh, and women often want a tighter look without losing curves. AOD may support that. In men, Cagrilintide is also powerful, but men sometimes undereat protein and lose strength. So again, muscle retention is key. Men also tend to like AOD because it supports the lean look without appetite destruction. Now, let's talk about safety concerns. Cagrilintide affects gastric emptying. So if you have a history of severe gastrointestinal issues or gastroparesis or chronic constipation, you need to be careful. Also, if you are stacking it with GLP-1 compounds, you can slow digestion too much, and that can become miserable. AOD 9604 is generally considered lower risk, but it is still a research compound, and the long-term data is not perfect. So, anyone using either of these should be monitoring their health, hydration, electrolytes, blood sugar, energy levels, and overall wellness. Now, let's get practical. If you came to me and said, I want to lose 30 pounds, I am hungry all the time, and I cannot stop snacking, what would I choose? I would choose Cagrilintide, because the appetite control will change everything. Now, if you came to me and said, I'm already leanish, but I want to get tighter, I want to lose that last stubborn belly fat, and I lift weights regularly, what would I choose? I would choose AOD 9604. Now, if you came to me and said, I want both, I want appetite suppression and stubborn fat targeting, then yes, stacking them can be an option. But you have to be smart, Because if you suppress appetite too much and also increase fat mobilization, you can end up feeling drained, weak, and underfueled. So if someone stacks them, they need to be serious about protein intake, electrolytes, and strength training. Now, let's talk about results timeline. With Cagrilintide, many people notice appetite reduction within the first week. Some people notice it within the first day. And within a few weeks, they often see significant scale changes. Now, with AOD, results are slower. Many people say they notice changes around week 3 to week 6. And the changes are more visual than scale-based, meaning you might look leaner before the scale dramatically changes. Now, let's talk about fat loss quality. Cagrilintide can lead to rapid weight loss, but rapid weight loss can sometimes create loose skin if someone loses too fast, especially if they're older or if they have a lot of weight to lose. AOD may support a slower, more controlled fat loss that gives the body time to adjust. Now, does that mean AOD prevents loose skin?
No.
But slower fat loss generally leads to better skin adaptation. Now, let's talk about hunger rebound. This is important. If you stop Cagrilintide abruptly, your appetite may come roaring back. Not always, but often. And this is why people need a plan. Because appetite peptides are powerful, but the habits still need to be built. You need to learn portion control. You need to learn protein-first eating. You need to learn how to manage cravings. Because if you do not, the rebound hunger can undo progress. AOD does not usually create rebound hunger because it is not suppressing appetite. So stopping AOD is less dramatic. Now, let's talk about real-world adherence. Most people will stick to Cagrilintide longer because it is weekly. Most people will quit AOD because daily injections get old. That is just reality. So when choosing a peptide, you need to choose the one you can actually stick with. Because consistency beats perfection. Now, let's talk about the look people want. Most people do not just want to be skinny. They want to be toned. They want to be curvy in the right places. They want to look athletic. They want that tight look. And this is where AOD can shine. Because AOD is often used for that body recomposition aesthetic. But again, you need training. If you want the tight look, you have to lift. Now, Cagrilintide can still help you get that look if you are lifting and eating enough protein. But if you are not, it can create a smaller version of the same body, meaning you lose weight but you do not change shape. Now, let's talk about appetite suppression versus fat oxidation. Cagrilintide is appetite suppression. AOD is fat oxidation support. So here is the truth. If you are severely overweight, appetite suppression is usually the fastest path to results. If you are moderately overweight or close to your goal, metabolic support becomes more important. Now, let's talk about which one is better for cholesterol and metabolic health. Cagrilintide, especially when stacked with GLP-1 compounds, often improves metabolic markers, blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, cholesterol profiles, triglycerides, and inflammation. Because weight loss itself improves those things. Now AOD may improve fat metabolism, but the metabolic improvements may not be as dramatic unless weight loss is significant. So if someone is using peptides primarily for metabolic health, Cagrilintide has an advantage. Now, let's talk about energy. Some people feel tired on Cagrilintide. And it is not because the peptide itself is a stimulant or depressant. It is because they are eating less. If you cut calories drastically, your energy drops. Now, AOD does not usually create that same fatigue, because you are still eating normally. So if someone is worried about feeling drained, AOD might be easier. Now, let's talk about the hunger types. There is physical hunger, and there is mental hunger. Cagrilintide targets both. It reduces physical hunger by slowing digestion, and it reduces mental hunger by changing brain signaling. AOD does not target hunger. So if your problem is mental hunger, AOD will not fix that. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest advantages of Cagrilintide. It can reduce cravings for sugar. It can reduce cravings for carbs. And it can reduce impulsive eating. That is why it is so powerful. Because fat loss is not just about calories. It is about control. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest advantages of AOD. It can be used without feeling like you are on a diet drug. Some people hate appetite suppressants. They feel like it makes them feel weird. They feel disconnected. They feel like food becomes unappealing. AOD does not do that. So, if you want a subtle enhancement without changing your appetite, AOD is attractive. Now, let's talk about the best protocol mindset. If you choose Cagrilintide, your mindset should be protein first. Strength training, hydration, electrolytes, and slow dose increases. Do not rush it, because nausea is the reason most people quit. Now, if you choose AOD, your mindset should be daily consistency, nutrition discipline, and training. And you should give it enough time to work. Because if you try AOD for 5 days and quit, you will never know if it was working. Now, let's answer the big question. Which one is better? Here's my honest answer. Cagrilintide is better for aggressive weight loss and appetite control. AOD 9604 is better for subtle fat loss enhancement and body recomposition, especially when diet is already controlled. Now, if you are someone who wants the fastest visible transformation, most people will see more dramatic results with Cagrilintide. But if you are someone who wants a gentle fat loss support without nausea and without feeling like you cannot eat, AOD may be a better lifestyle peptide. Now let's talk about the best of both worlds scenario. Some people use Cagrilintide for the first phase. They use it to lose the bulk of weight. They use it to break cravings. They use it to get control. Then once they are closer to goal, they taper off. And they transition into AOD for refinement, for stubborn fat, for tightening, for long-term support. That is a very smart strategy, because it uses each peptide for what it does best. Cagrilintide for appetite and major weight loss. AOD for sculpting and maintenance. Now, let's talk about realistic expectations. If you are hoping either of these peptides will replace the gym, they will not. If you are hoping either of these peptides will replace protein intake, they will not. If you are hoping either of these peptides will fix sleep deprivation, stress eating, and emotional burnout, they will not. But if you use them as tools while you build habits, they can be game-changing. Now, before we wrap up, I want to give you a simple way to choose. Ask yourself this question. Is my biggest problem hunger and cravings? If yes, Cagrilintide. Ask yourself this question. Is my biggest problem stubborn fat and slow body recomposition? If yes, AOD 9604. And ask yourself this question. Am I willing to inject daily? If no, Cagrilintide wins automatically. Now, last thought. The best peptide is the one that matches your real lifestyle. Not your fantasy lifestyle. Not the version of you that is going to meal prep 7 days a week. Not the version of you that is going to do cardio twice a day. The real version of you. If you need appetite control to get started, Cagrilintide is a powerhouse. If you are already disciplined and you want refinement, AOD can be a great tool. And if you want to get serious about transformation, you can use them strategically in phases. This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only, and it is not medical advice. I am not a doctor, and I am not diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Peptides and research compounds may carry serious risks, side effects, and unknown long-term outcomes. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider before starting, stopping, or combining any peptide, medication, or supplement. Thanks for listening, keep learning, and stay curious.